After I finish my lecture, you will be able to learn about creation of new settings, identify recommendations for new setting developers. You will also come to know about empowerment and analyze characteristics of new settings. Let me begin my lecture with the introduction. Saracen in 1974 defines social settings, and in his terms, I would like to tell you how he defines social settings. He says, by a new setting, I mean any instance in which two or more people come together in new and sustained relationships to attain stated objectives. The creation of settings is a key theme of community psychology. Some of these developments break new ground, pioneering social relationships in advance of those otherwise sanctioned by the existing social order. As such, they are prefigurative. However, there is always the threat of their setting or being forced into forms and ways that increasingly conform to the rules and norms of the dominant society. The interplay between prefigurative and reactionary tendencies tells us about the nature of a society and what will have to be done and what overcome to create social justice. For an innovation to successfully move beyond prefiguration will require a coalition of support extending beyond its immediate context. Ideas from the study of social movements are used to explore the connections between the creation of settings, social change, communities of interest, and ideology. Let me talk about strategy versus efforts. Firstly, I will tell you about the strategy for intervention, and then I will talk to you about community psychological efforts thereby. For example, the strategy for intervention is furtherance of critical consciousness education. Now, the community psychological efforts would be that community psychologists can work together to develop dialogical relationships which enable group conceptualize and understand the possibilities for change. They must be prepared to share their expert voice and remain open to learning. Another strategy for intervention could be creation of new forms of social relations, that is, new social settings. And the community psychological effort would be community psychologists can facilitate the bringing together of people with common interests and their allies and help them connect with others for greater power to change. Another intervention strategy could be development of alliances and counter systems. And now, the community psychological effort for this would be community psychologists can work to develop alliances that will challenge the status quo, build a counter system, and form part of wider emancipator social movements. Moving on to another strategy, giving psychology away. And now, the community psychological effort for this would be community psychologists have opportunities to use psychological knowledge and expertise in liberatory ways to make concepts and practices accessible and to develop participatory working relationships. Moving on to collective efficacy. Trust in the effectiveness of organized community action. An extremely influential concept in psychology, especially community psychology and beyond, represents a new approach to social capital by focusing on cognitive attributions and motivations that lead community members to engage professionals as collaborators rather than as authoritative experts. Next is influencing systems or broader change, as we can call it. The levels of intervention should reflect the multiple levels that contribute to the problem. Now you consider the typical intervention for most societal problems. For example, let's take the job training to address unemployment or drug awareness programs to counter substance abuse. This is typical of initiatives trying to change the behavior of those with limited power who are closest to the problem. For instance, let's say the low income adults, unemployment, or youth who are prone to substance abuse. Now, when used alone, service programs and targeted interventions such as the so-called at-risk adults or youth may deflect attention away from the more root causes such as poverty and the condition for opportunity that affect behavior at a variety of levels. Resolution of many societal issues such as crime or unemployment requires changes in decisions made by corporate and political decision makers at higher levels than the local community. System change does not occur simply by reporting felt needs to the appointed or elected officials. For those with higher economic or political status, simply expressing a concern may have influence on decisions that affect them. A variety of traditional means is available to such groups as a way of exerting influence. They include petitioning, lobbying, influencing the media, supporting political candidates, and voting in large numbers. These means are largely unavailable to those most affected by many societal problems, such as the children and the poor. So the purpose gets defeated. Marginalized groups lack the resources to exert influence in conventional ways. The great power of social movements is in communicating a different vision to the world. Marginalized groups use the drama of protest and the conflict it provokes to display realities not widely regarded as important. For example, the media may cover a strike and related protests by farm workers or coal miners and the violence it often evokes from owners, the police, and others in power. Now, media coverage helps convey the story of the conditions faced by the protesters and the unfairness of the action or inaction of businesses or institutions that are targeted. The dramatic nature of protest and related conflict can help politicize voters who, through enhanced public support of the positions of marginalized groups, can exert influence on those in power. Community organizations should seek changes within their power to manage. Since ignoring is likely and retaliation is possible, small organizations with limited power should avoid seeking fundamental changes in the system. For example, a single grassroots organization in a low-income neighborhood may not be positioned to effect systems changes such as altering the priorities of grant makers who support work in the community. But small and scrappy organizations may succeed in bringing about community change when their bulkier counterparts do not. Community and broader systems change can be brought about through collaboration. Collaboration involves alliances among groups that share risks, resources, and responsibilities to achieve their common interests. For example, local community-based organizations interested in the well-being of children can link with each other to create local programs, example mentoring, or policies, for example flexi time to be with children after school, and practices, for example adults caring for children not their own. Additionally, broader partnerships with grant makers, government agencies, and business councils can affect the conditions in which change occurs at the community level. An example is altering grant making programs to support collaborative work or promoting child friendly business policies through industrial revenue bonds or new corporate policies. Collaborative partnerships help bring about community and system change when they link local people to resources and institutions at the multiple levels in which change should occur to address common interests. Moving on to empowerment. It must mean more than individual psychological constructs which it's sometimes compared to or confused with. For example, self-esteem, self-efficacy, competency, locus of control. Secondly, an intentional ongoing process centered in the local community involving mutual respect, critical reflection, caring, and group participation through which people lacking an equal share of valued resources gain greater access to and control over those resources. Or simply a process by which people gain control over their lives, democratic participation in the life of their community. According to Rappaport, it is a critical understanding of their environment. So it is a core, a collective construct. Researchers usually agree that empowerment links individual well-being with a larger environment. The construct usually connects individual characteristics with acts directed towards social change. On the one hand, for Cole in 2006, empowerment means that individuals or groups have the capacity to determine their own affairs. Empowerment arises from processes that help people control factors affecting their lives. On the other hand, Fawcett et al. In 1994 refers to empowerment as a process in which stakeholders gain influence over events and outcomes that are important to them. Similarly, for Rappaport in 1987, empowerment is a process by which people, groups, and communities gain mastery over issues of concern to them. Empowerment is understood either as a process of acquiring control and the capability of successful action, or as an outcome of the empowering processes understood as the actual ability of individual stakeholders and communities to act. Now, stakeholders' empowerment involves group participation through which people lacking an equal share of valued resources gain greater access to and control over their resources. Scholars usually distinguish between empowerment as a process and empowerment as an outcome. According to this view, it is clearly a process that leads to greater control of resources by discriminated stakeholders. Empowerment at a community level can be regarded as somewhat analogous to group empowerment, as community stakeholders work together in an organized fashion to improve their collective lives, and links among community organizations and agencies that help to maintain the quality of life. Fawcett promotes the view that community empowerment is a process in which community members who share physical spaces, experiences, and concerns gain influence over conditions that matter to them. It remains unclear whether stakeholders' individual empowerment happens before, simultaneously, or after empowerment at the community level. This inconsistency is partially solved by Cole's observation that in empowerment at the community level, stakeholders become agents of change capable of solving problems they face while making decisions and capable of implementation of the proposed solutions. So, empowerment at a community level involves stakeholders' individual capacity to pursue common goals in joint actions. The capacity to act collectively combines actors' individual characteristics with supportive culture to challenge current power relations. Stakeholders manifest individual empowerment through their capacity for pursuing individual interests in a community field. Thus, it seems that theory implies that individual empowerment is a prerequisite to empowerment at the community level. Let me tell you about empowerment levels, processes, and outcomes. Firstly, I will talk about the level, then the corresponding processes, and finally the outcomes. Let's begin with the community level. The processes would be collective action to access resources, and the outcomes would be pluralism, coalitions, and community resources. Moving on to the next level, that is organization. The processes would be collective decision making, shared leadership. Corresponding outcomes would be organizational development networks, policy leverages, and finally the individual level, whereby the corresponding processes would be participation in community organizations, and the outcomes would be perceived control, resource mobilization, skills. Let me talk about characteristics of settings. Firstly is the resource cultivation, which involves activating of personal resources, opportunity role structure, participatory niches, increasing benefits, reducing costs of member participation, and finally mentoring. The next characteristic of settings would be belief system. Group based belief system, transcending self concern. Secondly, focus on strengths of members, and finally fostering of critical awareness among members. The next would be group climate, which would involve shared events, celebrations, inspiring leadership, peer-based social support systems, appreciating interdependencies, boundary spanning, and appreciating and managing conflicts. Next is task functioning, which would involve inclusive efforts to define community issues and resources. Secondly, structured clear goals and tasks. Thirdly, inclusive democratic decentralized decision making. Fourthly, shared leadership, and fifthly, subgroups for specific tasks or sectors of community. Next would be organizations studied for their empowering ways. Now, this would include self-help groups and educational programs. Secondly, religious congregations under faith-based community actions, service and advocacy organizations. Substance abuse prevention and health promotion coalitions. Environmental organizations, large companies, community development organizations, school-based associations, citizen advisory boards of government agencies, youth sports and recreation groups, community crime prevention groups, resident associations, and many other contexts. Next, I will be moving on to recommendations for creation of new settings. These are recommendations to policymakers, program planners for creation of new settings. Number 1. Greater attention should be paid to different levels of empowerment. We have to look beyond individualistic conceptions to collective conceptions that are commensurate with solving groups, organizational and community programs. Number 2 recommendation is smaller is better. Now, beyond the community and organizational level, high levels of policy making result in progressively more ambiguous conceptions of empowerment and diminishing returns. Now, local grassroots efforts may work best. Number 3 recommendation is the dialectic of empowerment. Other possible dialectics include 1. Emphasizing both personal and collective, and for some spiritual control. Number 2. The paradoxical requirements of leadership, order, and organization in helping others to help themselves. Number 3. People's need for both individual and community identity. And 4. For both change and stability. The personal and organizational benefits of empowerment along with its risks and challenges. A political orientation for both populism and progressivism. Next is an aspect to theory and research that allows for both deductive and inductive logic and both specific and general information. Pay more specific attention to what models of empowerment work with what population and in what settings and why. Next is the relationship between empowerment cognitions, person-environment transactions and behaviors must be explored. Now, in particular, because of many vague descriptions of empowering thought patterns, emotions and other intrapsychic constructions have clouded the concept. Greater emphasis on empowering behavior such as citizen participation in the community, workplace and government is needed. The 5th recommendation is that researchers need to become more familiar with the policy making process and more comfortable disseminating and directly applying their research, not just in a particular organization, but by working with executive, legislative and judicial bodies and advocacy organizations at all levels from local to federal and international agencies. Next recommendation is follow Coleman's 5 steps in planning effective policy research. Now, these 5 steps are: number 1, identify the parties in policy outcomes and with some power to affect the policy. Number 2, determine interests of these parties. Number 3, find what kinds of information are relevant to their interests. Number 4, determine the best way to obtain this information, and 5thly, determine how to report the results. Recommendation number 7. Policy researchers must become more proactive, not only in planning and evaluation stages but throughout the process, from agenda formation and policy adoption to policy implementation and review. Next is, researchers should play the role more of a learner or collaborator than scientist. Graduate programs in community psychology and related disciplines should do a better job of training for such a role. Recommendation number 9. Learn to disseminate more practical information and to deliver it in more user-friendly ways. Cultivate information channels within the policy making bureaucracy. This may include choosing multiple target audiences, like for example, legislators, voters, and other interest groups. Understanding each one's unique orientation and tailoring the focus and style of presentation accordingly. It requires the ability to present complicated theories and data concisely, in plain but accurate terms, that is, without overgeneralizing and overstating the case. Both theory and research would be more practical if more psychologists carefully examined and tried to understand the qualitative knowledge about real world empowerment processes that practitioners bring. The clearest definitions and descriptions of empowerment may come more from voices on the front lines of movements for social change than from the policy or even research literatures. Let me summarize what I have taught you today. A greater ability to bring about the changes you want to see. The collective voice of many people working together on a problem is usually more powerful than a single voice. I have also talked to you about empowerment, which is involving people, especially those who haven't traditionally had much power, in improving the conditions which shape their lives, can increase people's sense of their own worth and capabilities, helping them to live more fulfilling lives. Increased self-sufficiency among community members. Organizing people to bring about change helps maintain a high level of ownership by people for their own destinies. Ultimately, this reduces the amount of outside help that will be needed. Increase social support. By bringing together a diverse group of people who are working for the same cause, people get the chance to talk and learn with others they may not have met otherwise, both professionally and socially. Community organization offers ample opportunity for growth and enjoyment among those who come together. And finally, greater equity in the society. When people gain control over the forces that shape their lives, it changes the balance of power in the community, spreading it more broadly and distributing it more nearly equally. That in turn changes for the better the circumstances of those with the least power, making for more than just a just society.